Hello, welcome to the screencast presentation on the subject of environment and health intersections. In this session, I'm going to discuss a change in the way that we think about environmental issues to frame them as a human health issue and to sort of view the environment and human health as part of the same issue, and what that represents in terms of a change of focus and maybe thinking about how effective that is as an approach. I'm going to focus on two case study areas where the intersections between environment and health are particularly acute, and those are pollution and urban heat island effect. And then I'm going to talk about interventions as a way of thinking about effectively addressing environmental and health issues using the same programme of interventions. There's a large body of literature focusing on the health impacts of climate change and the health impacts of environmental degradation. And I've recommended some key texts which you can see on the final slide of this presentation. But the impacts are wide-ranging, and you can see a range of them here on this graphic on the right-hand side of the screen. So a lot of these may not impact UK populations particularly, although some of them absolutely will. But it's important to recognise that this is a global issue. So climate change obviously is a global issue. The drivers of climate change happen in countries like the UK in terms of the way that we live and consume. The impacts of climate change are felt globally. So we can't, this is an issue of climate justice as well as thinking about just particularly the UK context. So lots of these things that you'll see in this graphic here apply to populations that are impacted quite differently by climate change than our own. One of the things we want to think about now is really whether we start to think about environmental degradation and environmental change as a health issue primarily, and whether that is a useful direction to go because it elevates the environmental issues because we think of them in terms of human health impact. And in terms of assessing impact, does it make sense to continue to think about environment and health as two separate issues, or should we start to be assessing these things together? Before we get into some of the practical implications of this, I think it's interesting just to flag up that there is a really big debate going on within the environmental sector and has been for a very long time, back until the kind of 1960s really, about whether seeing human beings as the primary beneficiaries of the environment is actually the best way to go in terms of preserving a healthy ecosystem. So one of the arguments says that by taking an anthropocentric or human-centered view of the environment and seeing it as a resource, as a service provider, something that humans harvest and benefit from, that's kind of what has led to us being in the current situation, where the climate is really precarious and the way in which we've been using resources has become unsustainable. The opposite view of anthropocentrism is ecocentrism. And that's not to say that humans are out of the picture with ecocentrism, but actually we have equal weighting with other life on the planet. And this is really to take a far more holistic view. So in order to preserve the environment, we're not just thinking about it as something for human benefit, but actually we see ourselves as equal beneficiaries, and that it's as important to protect natural systems for their own sake as it is to protect them for human benefit. So that's something that, if you're interested, again, there's a wide body of literature on this. We're not going to get into it too deeply here, but there is a big philosophical debate kind of informing the environmental discussions that we're having today in a very applied way around planning. And these wider philosophical debates are actually impacting practical interventions that we can be discussing later on when we think about how we're actually moving forward in a way that's both more environmentally sustainable and actually better for human health. So when we looked at that first graphic, which listed some of the impacts of climate change on human health, it was obvious, as I said then, that a lot of those impacts are felt by populations in different parts of the world to our own. But there are impacts that are felt at every scale, from the local to the global. And as ever, with all the other health issues that we've discussed in the module, there are enormous inequalities in terms of who is impacted the most. And this concept of environmental justice, I think, is really important. If we focus only upon how we can protect our own local populations from the harshest impacts of climate change, then that's fairly futile, because the ways in which these earth systems work means that people who are polluting elsewhere in the world will be having a negative impact upon our environment, and vice versa. So we really have to think about this as a kind of global inequalities issue as much as anything else. And from the local to the global, it's still the case that some populations are able to escape the harsher impacts, but they tend to be the more privileged and the wealthier populations, and most people can't. So we can see that from global populations, where some people are left in areas with very precarious water supplies because of changing climates and pressure on water systems, through to people in countries like the UK who, poorer populations living in areas with worse air quality, that kind of thing. So this is, as with all those other issues, a question of balancing those inequalities and thinking about how we can improve health outcomes for the widest range of the population as possible. Air pollution is the first case study I'm going to look at. We've mentioned air pollution a number of times already because it comes up quite frequently, particularly in relation to things like transport and health inequalities in the UK. So public awareness around air pollution as a health issue is really on the rise, and particularly through the COVID crisis, we've started to realise that there are certain populations that are more vulnerable to cardiovascular and respiratory illness than others, and they tend to be living in areas with worse air quality. So there's a correlation between people who are more vulnerable to things like COVID and to flu, and the air quality of the areas in which those populations live. It's not the only driver, but it's certainly a factor. And it's getting to the point now where that is considered, that not just a correlation, but a proven causation between air quality and susceptibility to respiratory illness. The thing with air quality and air pollution, and this applies also to things like, pollution applies to water systems and to ground systems. We have, contaminated land and polluted water systems as well as air, but we're going to focus on air for this. Unlike a lot of those other kind of lifestyle discussions around health, so how you can improve your health by taking some ownership of the situation yourself and changing your lifestyle, which I already challenge as being maybe not the most helpful way to think about things. But air pollution is quite different, because actually that's not something that individuals can really influence on through changes to their individual behaviour. So whilst we can all contribute to cleaner air through things like not driving as much and those kinds of things, actually most causes of air pollution are systemic. And this the sources of air pollution slide that you can have a look at there on the right hand side just shows traffic and transport is a major contributor, but then so is things like agriculture, industry, manufacturing, mining, air travel. So whilst there are small behavioural things we can do, actually this needs to be driven far more top down, systemically. And again, along with many other forms of kind of climate health intersection, the impacts are very hard to avoid, apart from a very sort of small number who can get to cleaner air. But nevertheless, the nature of air pollution is highly complex, and pollution is distributed globally, and the impacts of pollution are felt globally. So it's actually really hard to avoid this. So if we're going to improve air quality, this needs to happen at a kind of, at an international level, to global level. It needs to happen in terms of, legislation and policy drivers. So when I'm thinking back to my earliest kind of awareness of environmental issues, probably, like 40 years ago, there obviously were discussions earlier than that, but that's as early as I can remember. Pollution was really talked about in terms of climate change, things like ozone layer depletion, acid rain, and that kind of thing. It was talked about as an environmental issue primarily rather than a health issue. So pollution contributes to changes in the atmosphere, as we know, and as you can see there in the graphic. And as mentioned previously, the distribution networks are very complex. So there are changes in kind of cloud processes and chemistry of the air and the sort of ways in which these pollutants are moved around the planet. So it's incredibly hard to control the flow of air pollution. And as well as obviously having the impact on the atmosphere, these pollutants get into not only human bodies, but into water bodies, into animals, into plants, into the soil, and fundamentally change and damage on all of those kinds of natural ecosystems. So thinking about how we reduce harmful pollution is one of the primary ways in which we can improve both the natural environment and not only human health, but wider ecosystem health. Another environment and health intersection I'm going to mention is urban heat island effect. So urban heat island effect, again, it's starting to be discussed as being important in the UK, even though we don't experience sustained periods of extreme heat as much as other parts of the world. But nevertheless, we have started to experience hotter and hotter time periods in the summer, and as we become a more urban population, these issues becoming exacerbated. So hot cities have a negative impact on human health through all sorts of kinds of, basically around heat stress, which can impact on premature births, increase accidents, and cardiovascular respiratory problems. So things like lack of shade and cooling. It also increases pollution density, and cities and buildings that are actually not designed for this changing climate. And as I say, we are seeing small increases in kind of global temperatures are exacerbated by this urban heat island effect. So if you don't know what urban heat island effect is, again, there's some key literature that's included at the end of this presentation. But it's essentially the ways in which the urban form creates heat through things like albedo effects, so the surfaces absorbing heat, and non-permeable surfaces reflecting temperatures back, and increasing the heat within the urban area in relation to the wider sort of rural areas that surround it. So cities are hotter than their surrounding areas for lots of different reasons, and that exacerbates health problems. Urban heat island effect also exacerbates environmental problems, so it increases air pollution and places stresses on the urban ecology. So if you have a city it's kind of a vicious cycle, really. So cities become denser in terms of their built form. They have more impermeable surfaces. They have less green space. They have more reflective surfaces. They have more heating and cooling systems, transport systems that all generate heat. And that rise in temperature then makes it harder for natural ecosystems within those urban areas to thrive. And those natural ecosystems are the things that mitigate and offset the urban heat island effect. So this is something that, left unchecked in terms of deliberate design interventions would continue to get worse and worse and worse. So the way that we build cities means they get hotter, and that makes natural elements harder to thrive, including humans within those areas. So we've established this relationship between environment and health impact. And again, I've just given a very brief overview, and there's lots that you can go and read about in more detail. But the positive element of this really is around interventions. So what we're now starting to think about really are interventions that simultaneously improve human health, but also address environmental health and improve environmental health. Most of the things that we are thinking of doing, particularly in terms of changing the way that we think about city design and function really will address both things. So developments that would have been assessed as having a negative impact on human health will also be things that will be harmful to the environment. So things like increased traffic, reduction in green space, all these increase in pollution, all the things that would damage the environment would damage human health, and therefore if we can actually try and reduce one, we're likely to impact upon the other. Which really brings us on to this issue of thinking about interventions and assessments of health and environment and whether we should bring these things together. So some of these these health and climate co-benefits examples that are provided on this graphic here, and there's lots of literature on this. So more renewable energy, less polluting forms of energy production, increasing the insulation in homes so that we reduce the need for energy, but also the interior kind of temperatures remain more stable, lower emission vehicles, public transport and active travel, reducing solid fuels for cooking, shortening the food supply chains and reducing the amount of meat in the diet was something again that would improve health and the environment, and local production of food. So there's just some examples really of things that would address both environmental impacts and would improve human health. And so this is the challenge, to think of these things together and not to see them as separate issues. If something would improve human health but damage the environment, would it only be improving human health to take something away somewhere else, or to make things worse further down the line? So this argument for viewing these two things simultaneously is strengthening all the time. One of the areas of these kind of co-benefits in terms of interventions is around nature-based solutions. So an awful lot of, if you think about the general theme in terms of improving health and environmental outcomes, a lot of those tend to be around reducing the big distinction between an urban area and a natural area. So greening cities, making cities perform more like a natural ecosystem, increasing things like urban green infrastructure and blue infrastructure, do things like have more permeable surfaces, have cleaner water systems, cleaner energy systems, get people out moving around more. So nature-based solutions are gaining traction as a way to simultaneously improve human health whilst also improving those wider environmental issues and reducing the impact of climate change, and sort of mitigating the effects of it, but also reducing the future harm to the environment through human habitation. So that's been a very brief summary. This is a really interesting, exciting development, particularly around the issue of assessing health impacts and health benefits together and thinking about interventions that are designed to improve both things. Here is some key reading on the subject that if you want to explore these issues, there's a wide body of literature, lots of things on the reading list, but here's just 3 that I think will be particularly relevant, and I look forward to seeing you in class.